Thank you for joining today for DirectWomen's webinar. We will get started momentarily. Thank you for joining today for DirectWomen's webinar, Paving the Way to the Boardroom, Building a Board-Ready Career. My name is Yesenia Chavarria, and I will be your technical moderator behind the scenes. I'm the Administrative and Events Specialist here at DirectWomen, and I'm excited to be hosting today's session. Before we get started, I'd like to run through a few housekeeping notes. You should all be able to see the screen now and hear my voice. Attendees, however, are muted, so although all of you can hear me, we cannot hear you. That said, you can still ask questions, and we encourage you to do so. Please submit your questions using the Q&A feature in the Zoom console, not the raise hand or chat features. Feel free to submit questions anytime throughout today's program. Today's webinar will be approximately 1 hour with 45 minutes of content, followed by a few minutes for Q&A. Links to our speakers' biographies will be provided in the chat once the program has begun. Lastly, there will be a short survey at the end of the webinar that we hope you will complete. It is only 4 questions and should take no longer than 2 to 3 minutes tops. With that, I will turn it over to the moderator of today's program, Yen Chu. Yen?
Thank you, Yesenia. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Paving the Pathway to the Boardroom, Building a Board-Ready Career. My name is Yen Chu, and I will be moderating today's program. I am currently the Executive Vice President, Chief Legal Officer, and Corporate Secretary for Tailored Brands, and I am also a 2018 alumna of the DirectWomen Board Institute and a member of the DirectWomen Board. For 18 years, DirectWomen has focused on fulfilling its mission to increase the representation of lawyers on corporate boards. Through our programming, DirectWomen helps to create a pipeline of legal leaders who can effectively serve in corporate boardrooms. We also serve as a resource for companies seeking qualified board candidates. And with that, I am pleased to be moderating today's panel with panelists Maria Green, Eve Howard, and Kathy Mahoney here with me today. Maria is a former Senior Vice President and General Counsel of Ingersoll Rand. She currently serves on the board of Fathom Digital Manufacturing Corporation, Little Fuse, Tennant Company, and WEC Energy Group. Maria is a 2015 alumna of the DirectWomen Board Institute and a member of the DirectWomen Board of Directors as well. Welcome, Maria. Good to see you. Eve is Senior Counsel, Global Head of Inclusion, Corporate and Finance Practice, former Global Head of Capital Markets Practice, and former Regional Managing Partner at Hogan Lovells US LLP. Eve currently serves on the board of Cogent Communication Holding. Eve is a 2021 alumna of the DirectWomen Board Institute and also a member of the DirectWomen Board of Directors. Welcome, Eve. It's great to see you. Finally, Kathy is former Executive Vice President, Chief Legal Officer, and Secretary of Spartan Nash Company. Kathy currently serves on the board of Village Farms International. Kathy is a 2017 alumna of the DirectWomen Board Institute. Welcome, Kathy.
Great to be here.
So with all that, as you can see, we have varied backgrounds from law firms to a variety of industries in-house. We look forward to sharing a range of perspectives, experiences, and advice with all of you as we discuss board prep, board skill sets, the role of networking, and then what do you do once you're on a board? So let me kick it off with the initial question of, so you all have these distinguished careers with a long list of accomplishments. At what point in your career did you start thinking, I want to be on a board? How do I get on a board? What prompted you to start? I'm going to start off with Maria.
Thanks, Yen. So it's great to be here with you and Eve and Kathy. For me, it was in 2012 when I first became General Counsel of ITW. And I was attending, like a General Counsel and Corporate Secretary, I was attending the board meeting and the Nominating and Governance Committee meeting and the Comp Committee meeting and the Audit Committee meeting. And I started thinking, I know what goes on in these meetings. I know what is important to directors, what they think about and how they think about strategy and other things. And I thought, this is something that I know, and this is a place where I think I could add value. So I started thinking about being a public company director in the context of what I had learned and where I could add value.
How about you, Eve?
Thanks. And also great to be here with you all. I look forward to this discussion. For me, similarly, although as the law firm representative, you're not in the boardroom every day, but I did spend decades advising boards, advising executive management teams on strategic transactions, financings, disclosure issues. And as I got sort of through the career arc within the law firm, and started thinking about what I might do next after doing this, for as long as I have and looking to what's next, I thought being on a board would be an excellent way to utilize the skills that I developed over the time as a practicing lawyer and add value in the boardroom. And it's a great transition from the full-time practice of law.
And Kathy, how did you start?
So, the bulk of my career in private practice was in litigation. So I'm a recovering litigator. So board service didn't occur to me until after the time that I went in-house. And candidly, I started participating in NACD activities, and I'd be in the sessions thinking, I know this stuff, and I've got a really good strategic mind, and I could really add value, and this is something I'd like to do. So it was relatively early in my in-house career, but candidly, I didn't do enough to kind of get myself sort of in the queue, so to speak, for it. But it was participating both in the board things as well as NACD.
Well, and I think that's what the value of this is
Mhm.
giving advice in terms of what I wish I could have done. So this is going to be a great conversation. So did you have an action plan to realize your goal once you decided, okay, this is interesting. I know this, I can do this, I understand this, I can add value. How did you go about putting together that action plan? How did you go about implementing it, which is even harder? And then ultimately, how did you land the first one? Everybody always says the first of everything is difficult. Your first general counsel job, your first whatever it is. How did you go about doing all of that? Let me start this time with you, Kathy.
So, one of the things that I've never done well is sort of put myself first, right? In terms of what's my action plan for my career. So for a lot of times I sidestepped and focused more on work or family or other things. And candidly, I wish I'd done more earlier on. But what I did do is in terms of, participating in the NACD things and then doing the DirectWomen Institute, which I recommend to everyone because it's really good. It's phenomenal. I also did the Kellogg's Women Directors Program, and I've done, some other programs as well. And candidly, those were helpful from the networking perspective. Because once you're in-house and you're the GC, and especially if you have a good board, you kind of have the basics, right? And a lot of other programs other than DirectWomen are geared, I think, more towards helping people understand what the board is and how it operates and how it works. And so, doing multiple programs, building the network was pretty important. And how did I get my first one? I'm different, right? But candidly, so this is not the norm. My company hired a search firm to help me. Is basically how I got my foot in the door.
How about you, Eve?
Great. So as I started to think about it, I thought very naively that here I've had this tremendous practice of law. I have had top-rate clients. I've had leadership positions. I'd like to be on a board. So I guess my phone's going to start ringing any time now. And but I was on a golf course actually, and this was right at the beginning of COVID. And a woman and I met a stranger, and she said we talked about our careers turns out she had been through the Board Institute and she recommended it to me. And it was about a month before the deadline for applications. And I decided that this sounds perfect and I will apply. And so my first action plan, other than waiting for the phone to ring, was to apply to the Board Institute. And then once in the Board Institute, really kind of followed the program. And one of the first things you learn, especially for those of us on this call in private practice, there's no one in private practice leadership that's going to say, we're going to help you get on a board, because it's not exactly it's not symbiotic with the business plan of a law firm. There are logistical issues, conflicts, and so forth. So, the Board Institute really helped define the plan, and that really was organizing the network and reaching out. And how I got my first board role was basically throwing darts is really what, they coach you to do, which is you never know where it's going to land and what's going to be the one that comes through. And one of the 50 or so emails I sent came through about a year after I sent it. So I'm really like a case in point for the kind of teaching that goes on at the Board Institute.
So you're saying it really does happen on the golf course.
It's amazing. And that woman and I we stay in touch and compare notes.
And Maria?
So yeah, and I always say, at least in my case, it was a marathon and not a sprint. Because as I mentioned, I started thinking about board service in 2012, and I didn't actually join my first board until 2018. So in my case, it was definitely a long process. I didn't really have an action plan as much as I just kind of thought about what are the things that I need to do before this can happen. And like everyone else, the DirectWomen Institute was phenomenally helpful in that regard. But in terms of just logistic things, if you're in-house, one of the first things you need to do is talk to your CEO. You cannot be on a public company board if your CEO is not in favor of that. And CEOs are different. Some CEOs love the idea of their other C-suite executives being on an outside board because they sort of feel like a rising tide lifts all boats. And whatever you learn at the other company, you'll bring back to your company, and best practices will proliferate that way. Some CEOs are very guarded and jealous of their executives. They don't want you doing anything on the outside. They feel like there's plenty to do, at the company, and they really just want you to focus on your full-time job. So if you're in-house, first talk to your CEO, make sure that he or she is on board. And if he or she is on board, then they'll be one of your biggest advocates because they'll talk to other CEOs, and they likely sit on other public company boards, and they will also give you permission to talk to your board and let them know that you're interested in board service. So for me, that was the action plan, if you will. And the way I got on my first board is, for me, it was all networking. Every single board that I have joined is because of my network. And my first board, I've told this story lots of times, but there's a woman, Marianne Hines, who was one of the first women GCs of a Fortune 500 company. And Marianne was here in Chicago with me when I was at ITW. She was at Fortune Brands. And she knew I was interested in board service. She got a call. She was fully boarded, and she referred them to me. And that's how I got on my first board.
Yeah, it's amazing. Of course, Marianne Hines is a legend, but it is amazing how there is no prescribed path. But I love hearing how each one of you has had different paths to your first board, and sometimes it is you throw as many darts as Eve said, and sometimes your company actually picks up the phone and makes that call, like Kathy. And and for you, Maria, it was just, I've been thinking about this and I'm going to do it well in advance, until it actually happens. I think it's great to have the juxtaposing views and perspectives. So I'm going to shift a little bit in terms of what do you need to get on the board? The skill sets. We've seen shifting in priorities and skills required for board service over the years. They've been done to address regulation. So started with, whether it started with Sarbanes-Oxley, Dodd-Frank, and then climate regulation, then focus on technology. So I remember when you did the skill matrix, and e-commerce was a big thing that a lot of companies looked for. Today it's AI. The demands of various stakeholders, whether it be shareholder activism, consumer preference for ESG, reporting, etc. So let's talk a little bit about board skills and the skills matrix and its evolution. I'd love to hear from each one of you. What skills would you recommend mid-career attorneys today acquire while they contemplate and start to lay the groundwork for board service? It obviously requires peering around the corner a little bit into the future, but were there any courses? And I know, Kathy, you've already mentioned NACD, and of course, we've all talked about the Board Institute. But are there any courses that you would recommend in particular? And what did you learn from the Board Institute, DirectWomen's Board Institute, that was really invaluable to you as you, not just the networking, but as you hone or enhance your skill sets? Why don't we start this one with Eve?
Sure. First of all, for all of you who are mid-career attorneys on this call, kudos to you, because really I didn't start thinking about this until, my resume was pretty well set. And as luck would have it, it had some good things on it. But thinking about it now, I really, I think it's terrific. A couple things I'd say, and this is obviously from my slant in private practice. Seeking leadership roles right from the get-go, whether they're within your comfort zone or outside of your comfort zone, I think are really critical. Because ultimately, and one of the things we've all learned from the Board Institute is that boards generally are not looking for lawyers. They're looking for business people. They're looking for business-minded folks. And the way you get that kind of mindset helpfully can be in a leadership role where you're sort of practicing that kind of skill. And I guess the second thing I'd say is really important is financial literacy. So it's easy for, a corporate attorney like me doing transactions, doing financings. I was in financial statements all the time, but I think having some sort of financial literacy, I don't have specific courses to recommend if it's not something you get in your daily lives, but I do think showing and demonstrating that you have that is important. And then finally, I don't think it'd be a bad idea really from the get-go to start a spreadsheet that would be, you call it your network spreadsheet, your board network spreadsheet. And as you meet people and encounter people, clients within your alumni networks and so forth, think about who would be a good contact later on for, who's going to be in boardrooms, who may be CEOs, that you can continue to stay connected with in a natural way. So I'll stop.
How about you, Maria? What skills do you think a mid-career attorney today should start to think about or try to acquire if they don't currently have it in their day-to-day role?
Well, I guess one of the things I would just echo what Eve has said. So my background was as an M&A lawyer. And if you're not, in financing or M&A, absolutely critical that you're financially literate. You need to be able to read a balance sheet and a P&L statement and a cash flow statement. That is table stakes. So if you don't have that background, take a course, an accounting course, a finance course, so that you understand, what that's all about. And then, I know you look at, if you go to the proxy of a public company, likely you will see the skills matrix and you will see the skills that the sitting directors have. But you'll also, you can sort of sense maybe what's missing once you see the skills that are on the board. But I think even though AI is really important nowadays, a couple of years ago it was ESG. And before that, it was DEI. So, there's always sort of a flavor of the moment. But I think that the constant is you need to be a good strategic thinker, and you also need to understand enterprise risk and how to manage risk. So those are the kind of table stakes skills again: strategic thinking and enterprise risk management. Other things, it might be good at any point to maybe know AI or something else, but I don't think that companies choose directors for just one skill. They want somebody who's well-rounded. So really think about the financial literacy and becoming a good strategic thinker.
Kathy?
So from my point of view, I agree with everything that both Eve and Maria have said. Learning about business and in a demonstrable way so that it's there on your resume and people see it when they talk to you, I think is sort of key and critical because, boards don't think twice about the fact that they need to have CFOs on boards. But they don't think they need to have lawyers on boards, and hopefully that's changing. But I mean, I still remember the first time I was brave enough to say to the head, candidly, of the board search practice at a major search firm, I was interested in board service. She just looked at me and said, boy, never in my career has anyone asked for a lawyer, right? So it's not usually the first ask. And I think that's because there's that stereotype out there still of lawyers being no persons. Here's all the reasons why you can't do what you want to do, right? So the things that you can do to demonstrate that you really understand the business, if you're in-house and you're asked to be on a business project, say yes as fast as you can, and if you're outside counsel working on something, make sure that you're asking the questions so that you understand how the business works so that you can overlay your strategic thought and make that sort of demonstration. Because it was by me getting ingrained in the business that I ultimately was asked to run one of our divisions, right? So it's that kind of stuff that gives you the lawyer plus credibility. And I so agree on the financial acumen. And I mean, I went to a state teachers college, so I don't have the sort of, educational credentials that a lot of folks do. So I needed to get into the finance, even though I knew how to read a P&L and balance sheet and all of that. And I took the class on finance for senior executives at Harvard Business School, and it was awesome. So I'd recommend that for people to consider if they're trying to do something to amp it up, because this was more, how do you delever a beta and how do you do free cash flow and all that sort of stuff, that when you're sitting in the room when this is being discussed, you understand what the concepts are.
That's really great. I think obviously the overarching theme is understand the business, understand the financials. I always think when people say, do you understand the business? Follow the money. How does the company make money? Because you can gauge risk. You can gauge all those other areas based on that. I'm gonna play a little bit on the different perspectives because we are so fortunate to have people here from both law firm as well as in-house. So I want to play a little bit on how it's different in each area. How for Kathy and for Maria, how do you feel that the role of the industry has played for you in getting on a board? So for Maria, you were general counsel at Ingersoll Rand, a manufacturer of air compressor, power tools, and lifting and material handling systems. How much of this background in the manufacturing industry helped you get on the boards of the companies you're on? Tennant Company, Wisconsin Energy Group, Littelfuse, and Fathom Digital. And once you were on, how much did you use that background to leverage your understanding of those businesses?
So actually, it was critically important for me because in addition to being the general counsel of Ingersoll Rand, before that I was the general counsel of ITW, which is another industrial manufacturing company. And all of my boards are industrial manufacturing companies, well, other than Wisconsin Energy, which is a utility. But for me, it was very much a case of having that industry knowledge. And again, we talked about networking, and frankly, a lot of my network was in that industry because that's the industry that I worked in predominantly. So for me, it was critically important, and it's easier to understand. At least for me, it was easier to understand the business like Tennant or Littelfuse having that industrial manufacturing background. So I would just say, I don't think I was considered by boards outside of industrial manufacturing. And I'm not sure I would have considered. I mean, it would have been interesting, but I really wanted to play to my strengths. And that's really the industry that I knew well.
What about you, Kathy? You were the CLO of Spartan Nash, which is deals with food distribution, and then you joined Village Farms International as a board member. So share with us your experience in the food industry and how that has influenced your board service and your trajectory.
So it wasn't as important as it was with Maria, but it's one of those things that I think initially the company said, okay, she'll understand, the business, right? I mean, just in terms of the concept of food and, getting it to your table. But it turned out that what was more important to the company was candidly my experience dealing in a regulatory environment, right? Because if you look at Village Farms International, I'm not sure what the website says today, but it's two main components of business. One is produce, right? And the other is cannabis, believe it or not, right? Where it's legal in Canada, which is why the corporation is incorporated in Canada. And so, you're dealing with the regulatory hurdles in the US, which we don't do any cannabis in the US because the federal government, doesn't permit it. But there's CBD in the US, right? And so I had been involved at our company, both in terms of sort of orchestrating what our action plan would be when Congress passed the Farm Bill, making hemp production, kind of okay, and allowing some constituent parts of it to be sold. Plus, I was also involved in, we were named to be the sole distributor for a large company getting into tobacco for the first time. So I had to, had to go through 50 states and all this sort of stuff. So for that company, it was more the fact that I could like parse through regulations and come up with strategies, as opposed to the fact that I knew food. Now it's helpful to me now that I'm there, but it didn't open the doors the way Maria's did.
So I'm gonna shift a little bit because the law firm model is very different. It is not based on industry. It is focused on subject matter experts. So, Eve, what advice would you give to mid-career attorneys looking for future board service? You have a background in corporate law and you are a regional managing partner of a global law firm. So I think of running P&Ls for the firm, but also international. So for law firm partners, how has that been helpful for you? And your transactional practice runs across multiple industries. Has the lack of industry focus hurt you in any way, or does it create obstacles in terms of targeting a specific type of company to join a board?
Would it be too glib to say that the easiest path might be to become a general counsel and and then hop in from there? But no, it is something that you hear over and over again from headhunters that really, private practice, as much as we believe and know how much it gives us in terms of perspectives and how many different companies we've advised and how many different boards we have been in, how many different boardrooms and seen all kinds of issues. As a practical matter, really the search, it's something you have to, in a way, get over, obviously subject to your network, because like Maria and Kathy have already said, it's really all about your network. I will say, law firms provide a couple of additional logistical problems, one of which is conflicts. If you're at a large global firm that has 3 million clients, those clients are essentially off limits if they're in any way substantial for board service, and they tend to be the ones you have the contacts with. And then there's the, an independence rule where if a company has paid your law firm, X dollars, it's not even that much, then you're not considered an independent director. And so you would be pretty, you would not be very valuable in that regard. But I'm here to tell you that it is possible. And I think it's by the fact that I don't have, my subject matter expertise is financing and strategic transactions, M&A, but it crosses all industries. So one of the things I've noticed when I look at a lot of board searches that come across my desk, must-haves are direct industry expertise, whether it's in the food industry or in utilities or banking or financial services. So many law firm partners have that expertise, really practice in the area of healthcare or in financial services. So I think you have the same benefit in that regard when you have that specific focus. My focus was not industry specific, and I did financings for just about anybody. And so again, not ideal, but you have to present your sort of business case however you find it. So, all hope is not lost, because I think I probably represent the biggest hurdle to a headhunter. I didn't use a headhunter because, as we've all said, it's all comes mostly through your own contacts, but it can still happen. And it really, I'd reiterate, focus on leadership, but because I think running a practice group, running a region is really akin to being in the C-suite of a company. So,
and I mean,
I don't want to be too negative, but it is, I also don't want to be unrealistic.
well, I think given that some of our audience are currently at law firms, I think it is very good to hear realistically what they need to do to prepare to get, if this is a goal. And I think, your background with respect to corporate transactions, financings, et cetera, is helpful because you understand the structure and the governance and the organization, the general corporate structure for the company. But so how do I give hope to the litigators out there? Kathy, you mentioned that you were once a litigator.
Mhm.
So I want to make sure that everybody in the audience gets a sense of, like, it's not impossible. There are certain things that you're going to need to address and work on. How has being a litigator before becoming a chief legal officer, that background has been helpful? How's that been helpful to you as a board member?
It's been really helpful, right? Because if you're a litigator and if you do it well, you're a problem solver. I mean, just like if you're an M&A lawyer or, a financing lawyer, you've got to figure out a way to get to the end game. But that's like the litigator's whole game is, here's the set of facts that my client just gave me. What am I going to do with it, right? Do I have to settle this right away? Do I sue it out? What do I do? And so it's that critical thinking, strategic thinking, and being able candidly to persuasively present ideas and alternatives. That's really very helpful. So those of us on the call who are either present or past litigators, lose not all hope. It's a really important skill set, and not something that sort of limits you in a way. And going a little bit sideways here, you know, one of the things that you want to do is make sure you're taking a whole account of yourself. Because I still think of myself as a litigator, even though it's been a lifetime since I was actually in court. But I did something that candidly I thought was pretty smart, is I asked one of our board members to take a look at my board bio, that you put together after the DirectWomen Institute and the things. And he called me up and he goes, Kathy, you're an M&A lawyer. You don't understand it, but think of all the deals that you've done, and you're not highlighting that M&A skill set, right? So sorry to go a little bit sideways, but just make sure you take a full picture of yourself and just put it all out there.
I agree with that. I think sometimes whatever you cut your teeth on initially
Mhm.
in your career,
Exactly.
yourself that way, irrespective of the number of years that counter those initial years
Mhm.
where you've done employment law or done whatever it is. So yeah, no, that's very helpful to kind of get outside of your own view of yourself.
Now,
So
I would just say also, just add on, I mean, to me, the most compelling quality you can bring outside of industry and expertise is really sound business judgment.
Mhm.
And I think that in the way that in whatever career you've been in, that you develop a reputation as someone who has very sound judgment, unflappable, uh, and, business practicality, not, a lawyer's lawyer always worrying about, all the risks. I just think that can really rise to the top in terms of your body of work.
Yeah, I think Maria had touched on that as well with the strategy and the risk management and just kind of looking at the enterprise overall. I think that's you've all echoed the same. I mean, it is so vital because they have a general counsel, or a chief legal officer. They don't need another one. They are asking you to come and provide your business judgment on a lot of these things. So we've all talked a little bit about networking. I want to really dive into it because you've got your skills, you've kind of got your plan, whether it's loosely defined, but you have a general arching goal. You've got some of the skills, you've gone to NACD, you've taken certain courses, whatever, what have you. We all know and some of you used a search firm, some did not, whether your board role ultimately came through via a search firm or word of mouth on the golf course or what have you. There's no doubt that networking plays a factor, not just in seeking a position these days, but also in terms of board, at minimum to build your reputation. So how did you build your network with board service in mind? Let's start with Maria.
So I guess a couple of things I would say. One is, so maybe just to kind of piggyback on the last issue. I don't think people should lose hope if they're in-house, if they're litigators, there's always a pathway. But what you need to really focus on are, what are the skills that you bring, and really talk about those skills. Absolutely right. Nobody says, oh, I want a lawyer on my board. Although they used to say they didn't want GCs. Now they say they want GCs. Of course, they don't want a GC on their board, but they always want a CFO and they always want a CEO. So, I think you have to think about it in terms of
another CTO,
you have this
another CMO.
Absolutely. So as a general counsel, you bring as much value as a CEO or a CFO. But in terms of how you build your network, as I said earlier, a couple things. If you're in-house, absolutely start with your CEO, start with the other people in the C-suite, your CFO and your CHRO. And once you get the consent of your CEO, talk to your board. Let your board know that you're interested in board service. And one of the things that we all learned at the Institute is network with everyone. Network with your babysitter. Network with the guy who empties the trash in your office every night. You never know where the opportunity is going to come from. As I said, I met with Mary Ann. I told her I was interested in board service. It was really more on a social level that I let her know that. And for me, every single one of my boards came through my network. I never used a search firm. As I said, my first board was through Mary Ann Hines. My second board was through someone who was the head of FP&A at ITW when I was general counsel. She left to become CFO of a company. There was an opportunity there for a director. She told me about it. I came in, I talked to the CEO, I talked to the nominating and governance committee, and that's how that opportunity came along. My third board, I was on a board with someone and he recommended me for another board that he was on. So in my case, it was all about networking. I would say just tell everyone. You never know where the opportunity is going to come from. Don't think, oh, this person is not in a position to know about board opportunities or know about board seats. You just don't know. If you're in-house, again, tell your outside counsel that you're interested. Just let everybody know, because people don't naturally think of, frankly, a lot of times as women, they just don't think of women as someone who's potentially a great director. And if you don't let them know that you're interested, they would, they'll think, oh, well, that person's not interested in being a director. So just put it out there, make sure everybody knows what your interest is, and tell everybody would be my advice.
Eve?
You're here. Yes, and I'd say particularly directed at those that are more junior in career. I assume some on this call. A lot of the people that you're working with who are at your level in banks and companies, ultimately you all rise together in the corporate ladder in the law firm world, and they become CEOs. And so it really pays to really get out there with your peers, not necessarily the people that are above you, and grow up together. That has been, I mean, as a lawyer, that helped me the most in terms of getting clients and bringing in clients were people that became senior with me. But I'd say one of the things that resonated that I learned through the Institute was you really do never know who is going to be the most helpful to you. And in fact, some of the people you think would be the most helpful to you, the people who've known you the longest, who, from when you were, baby lawyers, sometimes still think of you as baby lawyers. And it's the people that you've come in contact with more recently when you've had more seniority in your career that can be the most helpful of you in your career. And that was a little counterintuitive to me, but I've kept that in mind.
Kathy, you kind of touched on that earlier as well, where I think you said one of the things is I always had my head down working and didn't network as much. So what got you out to say, you know what, I need to change things?
So I think it was sort of finally taking the affirmative step when I did the DirectWomen's program, because otherwise, like Eve, it's like, why isn't my phone ringing, right? I mean, I'm really good and I'd be so helpful. And I can't echo enough everything that Maria and Eve have said. If you're in-house, the CEO is key. And if he or she is a supporter, that's great. In my case, it was the CEO who went to the board first to say, hey, I had this conversation with Kathy and she's really very interested and I'm really very supportive, which made it easier for me to have the follow-up conversations with them. And then don't forget former board members or former CEOs or former executives that you worked with before to kind of reach out and just sort of let people know that you're interested. Outside counsel can be really helpful, just in terms of, giving you thoughts, giving you ideas. And candidly, I think one of the hardest things about getting ready to sort of enter the foray is getting your stuff ready. Getting your elevator pitch, getting your board bio, getting your CV, because there's so many different thoughts and theories out there about what you can look. And for someone like me who is just like a little hesitant about asking for help, right? It was easier to say, "Hey, I hate to impose, but could you take a look at my papers and tell me what you think?" Right? And so it was a good, opening entree to, but also I got some incredibly good feedback through it all. So
That's fantastic. All right, so you've prepared, you have your goal, you've prepared, you've gotten your skills, you've networked. This is it. You got the interview. So, how did you prepare? You've required everything. How did you start to prepare for the interview? And most importantly, how is that interview for the board seat different than a job interview? Why don't we start with you, Kathy?
So read everything and learn everything you can about the company, right? Especially at the business. Any challenges they might be having, any regulatory issues, any missteps, any really, good results that they've received. And then learn what you can about the people that you're interviewing with. Because in my experience, interviews are different, right? My first interview was with the in-house executive who was working with the board, right? To fill this position. It was just, and this was like right at the end of COVID, so it was all by Zoom, right? So there weren't any in-person interviews. So that was the first interview. Then the second interview was with the CEO, right? And the CEO, candidly, I think was trying to assess what kind of a person I would be, right? What kind of a person would I be on the board? Not gauging my skill sets, like, are you smart enough, right? But it was just more, is this going to be a trusted advisor? Is this someone who's just going to be a negative influence alike? And then the next was with actual board members, which was a different interview in that I was able candidly to parlay the things I'd parsed out from their legal filings in terms of challenges that they might be dealing with that might not be all that obvious which I mean, at one point I got an incredible kudo from him, right? So three different interviews, all different, pitches and different opportunities. So that's where your skill set, reading the room, comes in. Is this someone who wants to know I'm smart enough? Is this someone who knows I'm not a threat? Is this somebody who wants to know I understand the business and going from there?
Great. How about you, Maria?
So definitely agree with everything that Kathy said. Read the Ks, the last couple of years of the 10K, read the Qs, the proxy, all of the public documents that are out there. And again, Kathy's absolutely right. Read those documents, and once you get in the interview, that's the great opportunity to take what you've learned and ask strategic questions. So you can show you're a strategic thinker. You can show that you have knowledge of some of the issues that the board is dealing with, that the company's dealing with, and what kind of perspective you would bring. So definitely use that opportunity in the interview to show your ability to think strategically and to also think in terms of risk management and risk mitigation and how you would help the company as it thinks about enterprise risk management. And really for me, again, agree completely with Kathy. It's absolutely about, they're looking for primarily, because the table stakes is, you're smart, you're strategic, you think about enterprise risk. That's kind of a given. I think that in the interview, what they're really looking for is, will you be a good colleague in the boardroom? Is this somebody, when we're in the trenches and times get tough, is this somebody that I'm going to want to be in the room with and help me strategize about how we get out of the situation? So they're looking for, it doesn't have to be, homogeneity. It doesn't have to be that you're just like everybody else on the board. It just has to be that you're collegial and you're willing to, even when you disagree civilly. So show that you have an ability to be collegial. And if you disagree with someone, that you can do that in an agreeable way. I think that's really important. And also just the ability to, in a crisis situation, are you someone who's going to run around with your hair on fire? Or are you someone who's going to stop and think and try to think strategically about how you get out of the situation? So show your ability to deal with the crisis. And show that you're someone who would be a good colleague in the board.
I have nothing to add on the prep. That obviously it's prepare. I just relay one anecdote, which is the flip side of this. It's an interview both ways, really, because as much as before I got on the board I'm on, I had an interview for one other board. And it became clear to me during that process that this was not really a problem I wanted to put myself in the middle of. And so I do think you need to be discerning. Board service is not without risk. And, as much as you are trying to get the job and wanting to get the job, sometimes you have to kind of step back and say, maybe this is not a good fit. And that's just a cautionary tale. Luckily, the company and I were aligned that it wasn't a good fit. So and the other little piece is know what the job is as lawyers. We need, and particularly for the folks that are in-house, the job of a board is governance. It's not management. And I think as lawyer, I felt like I had to hammer that home, that I understood that. I was not going to be sitting in the room trying to manage.
So Eve, if I could just add to that, when I got on my first board, one of the first things I did was I called up the GC and I said, just so you know, I am not the general counsel. I don't plan to come in and address legal issues. I'm going to stay in my lane. And sure enough, first meeting, a legal question came up and all eyes turned to me. And, I said, that's a question for your GC. Mm-hmm. And it is really critically important that you remember that your role is oversight. It's not management. If there's an issue with management, then you should replace management. You shouldn't try to manage the company. And it's not just lawyers who do that. CEOs do that. They think I've had a great career as a CEO. I know how to run a business, and they come in and they want to roll up their sleeves and manage the company. And if there's one thing that you should remember that's critically important, is that from a governance perspective, you're there for oversight and not to provide day-to-day management.
Excellent point, and always a good reminder to everyone on the board. I'm gonna leave a little bit of time for Q&A. So before we get into Q&A, which I see a lot of people have asked in the Q&A chat already, I'm going to ask each one of our panelists to just give one specific piece of parting advice to the attendees considering corporate board service, something quick, pithy that they're going to take with them before we launch into the Q&A. So Maria?
I would say, again, at least for me, it's a marathon, not a sprint. So enjoy the journey, enjoy the networking and all the things that you learn along the way.
Fantastic. Eve?
I feel like I've given a lot of advice along the way to something new. I would, cut your teeth on a nonprofit board. I think we have some questions in the chat about that. We could talk about it more specifically, but it can be helpful in terms of your experience.
Kathy?
I'd just say grab any opportunity you can to be involved in the business, to be able to demonstrate, both to learn kind of, some of the business ins and out, but also to be able to demonstrate your business acumen.
So you're right, Eve, there are a couple of questions relating to nonprofit, whether, is it helpful to be on a nonprofit board? Is it helpful to volunteer for a nonprofit? Are the skills transferable, etc.? Eve, do you want to take that a little bit?
Yeah, I can start. I'm sure Kathy and Maria may have other thoughts, but to me, it was an important start for me in understanding board leadership and dynamics. I had leadership roles on nonprofit boards for schools and did head searches and really had to do a lot of people management. And more than that experience is not particularly impactful, I don't think, on a resume. But for me, it was impactful in the experiences I got dealing with difficulties and using that sound business judgment that we talked about and being unflappable, and then also the networking, because a lot of your co-trustees, co-directors on nonprofits are people who can be really valuable in your network. So that's what I'd say about that.
There's a question in here that I think is actually really interesting, which is that, we've talked a lot about the value that, on a personal level, what is the biggest value that serving in a board brings to you? You've talked a lot about the value that board members bring to the board, but what about the flip side? I think this person needs to be convinced as to why they should be interested in joining a board. What have you guys all got out of this that you think this is worth it for me?
Well, I guess I'll jump in. For me, as a retired GC, a lot of it is just keeping in the game. The mental acuity of dealing with the board issues, continuing to be involved in a business. And I have really tremendously enjoyed my other board members, the people that I've met, the other directors. I've formed strong relationships. And one of the things I would suggest is, once you get on a board, get yourself a board buddy. Find someone else who's on the board. Talk to them before every meeting, talk to them after every meeting, because issues will come up, and because you don't have the backstory, you don't have the history, you may not get the full picture. So have somebody that you can go to after the meeting and say, hey, what was really going on with this issue? What was that discussion really about? What's the history of this? So by getting a board buddy with every board that I'm on, I've formed relationships that have been really meaningful relationships for me. And also just being involved mentally and staying mentally alert has been an important part for me.
To add to that, I think, and it's not direct, it's not immediate, but I'd like to think that as I, stop having a leadership opportunities in my day-to-day world, that I have the decisions that I make, the questions that I ask, may, help steer an organization in the right direction. And that to me is meaningful.
And I agree completely. I mean, especially once you retire, it's a great way to stay active and to keep those business juices flowing. But at the end of the day, one thing that lawyers always do is help, right? You try to make things better. And it is knowing that your participation is either helping identify something people haven't thought about or a way to get, to where they want to go, or just saying, yeah, I agree. It's a great job, team, right? It's a good way to add value and make things better.
So one of the questions here is, do you have different advice for lawyers retiring from law firms? I would also say from those retiring from corporations, um, more or less conflicts, et cetera, but also in less competition, versus advice for those actively working as law firm partners or general counsels.
I think this is a bit of an art because and I felt this. You don't want to be 10 years out from, the practical experience of your expertise, and yet you have to have the time. So I think being retired or stepping down or ramping down is very helpful because it gives you the space to do what you need to do to get on a board, be on a board as an effective board member. But I think if you've let too much time go by, it can be a bit of a detractor because you've been out of the game.
Yeah, I agree, Eve. And, let's not underestimate the amount of time. It takes a tremendous amount of time. Typically, the board meets 4 times a year, and you think, okay, so that's 4 meetings a year. But realistically, there are always special committees. If the company is doing an acquisition, they may want a special acquisition committee. If they're going through a new strategic plan, they may want you to work with Boston Consulting Group or whoever they have helping them with the strategic plan. If you're on the nominating and governance committee and you're recruiting a new director, you may have to interview and meet with potential candidates. So it's not just the 4 meetings a year and all the reading material that goes along with that. There are so many other things. So it's a serious time commitment. And frankly, if you're working full time, likely you can't do more than one board. If you really want to do it effectively and do it in a productive way.
Totally agree. Because one of the things that I found is, not all boards are as buttoned up in terms of when they get the materials to board members, right? So you may be in a situation where there's an important meeting and an important vote, and you're getting materials last minute. And if you're also involved in something at work that's really time critical, that's going to be really hard to manage. So that if you're ramping down, that's an ideal time to start. One of the challenges, though, about waiting until after you've retired is that as Eve mentioned, it's not that long a period of time, before people view you as being too distant, right? Or a professional board member, as opposed to somebody that's bringing active live skill. So it really is a tap dance.
I agree. I think I've had a number of colleagues who are about to retire or who just retired call me up and say, so how do I get on a board again? And I thought, if you're listening to this panel right now, you're way ahead of that person for sure. Because I do think that you should start thinking about it. Doesn't mean that tomorrow you're going to get on that board, but you should start thinking about a lot of that stuff and then keeping some of those skill sets fresh and whatnot. I know we're almost at time. I do want to have one question because I do think, and to the extent that anybody here can give some advice, a person asked about a lawyer in the public sector. What tips do you have to become attractive and ready for board service there? I know that DirectWomen has had members of its class come from the public sector. And so while we have talked very heavily on law firm and in-house, any insights for this public sector person would be great. I think maybe, we talked about regulatory and we talked about some of that. So I don't know, Kathy, if you want to talk a little bit more about your experience in regulatory and how that may be akin to whatever part of the public sector this individual is in.
I think that's a really good point, Yan. I mean, I spent 6 or 7 years in the Minnesota Attorney General's office, in addition to like the governmental service clerkships and that sort of stuff. And you really get very good insight into how government actually works as opposed to how the paper said it should work. And so, focusing in on sort of the regulatory issues and, subject matter expertise. But I think for folks who are in the public sector, I really do think nonprofit board service is really very important because you won't have the opportunity to see how a corporate board actually interacts, right? Because you don't get invited into the boardroom, you don't get to see that. And while there are differences between how nonprofit boards operate and for-profit boards operate, there's a lot of the basic things, right? And that'll give you the footing to talk about why you'd be successful at it based on what you've seen and how you've added value. And I think you combine the two of those together, I think you're in a pretty good place.
So I'm going to apologize. I know we are at time and there isn't enough time to answer all of the questions. I can work with the DirectWomen team to answer some of the nuts and bolts questions, like, for example, NACD, what is that? National Association of Corporate Directors, and those types of things. And then we can try to close out some of the others for people. I want to thank all of our panelists for taking the time to speak with us and providing us with such wonderful insight. We appreciate the experiences you've shared, Maria, Eve, and Kathy. And to our audience in particular, thank you for listening. We hope that you'll join us again for future webinars and that you found today very helpful. By attending today's webinar, you will receive DirectWomen's monthly newsletter and special updates. Fascinating to see the network and those who went through the Board Institute get their board seats. That may spark your own networking and your own connections. Please stay tuned for information regarding future webinars and other DirectWomen program and events. Again, thank you all. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the audience. Farewell and take